Welcome back. We still have two more kings left. Before I read those, I just want to point something out. In the last two notebooks, we saw mention of the Watcher and a work called Words, which is actually a set of prophecies made by the Watcher. And this will come back in the story of the Path of the Shell. Okay, the next king is Asemleth. King Asemleth took the throne in 5999 DE at the age of 54. Asemleth inherited a people who were philosophically confused, the Watcher versus Gish versus the Great King/Devar, but technologically advancing, many great construction, mining and scientific inventions, expanding within the cavern at a great rate and moving toward diminishing the involvement of the outsiders within their culture. As well, the fighting that had scarred their past was at a minimum. Asemleth continued the peaceful trends by attempting to isolate no one, but instead welcoming everyone and any beliefs they might have had. It seems he took no stance on any of the varying religious ideologies being passed around and allowed any and all religious factions equal access to property, government help, etc. While disregarding no beliefs, he was able to hold his own, some of which were unknown to Dany up to that point. Though never stated publicly by Asemleth, common opinion and historical records point towards numerous servants being used by Asemleth, most brought from outside ages. More so were the apparent challenges Asemleth held with these servants. Details are hard to find, but it seems as though these challenges ranged from hunts by Asemleth himself to gladiator-style battles between the servants. It should be noted that regardless of what actions occurred, there was little public outcry against them. Instead of philosophical or religious beliefs, Asemleth instead focused on mining expansion, construction of the new districts and offering equal opportunities of culture and social benefits to all classes. As far as outside involvement, Asemleth publicly argued that the order from his father to all of the guilds was not realistic and that outside involvement would always be needed to some extent. Knowing the comment would anger some of the factions, he became the first king to publicly invite the more extreme factions, who wanted no outside involvement, to his palace for numerous talks on the issues. Though no decisions were made in the meetings themselves apparently calmed the factions and created a better overall feeling of that the two could come to a decision in the future. Around the same time, two key writers from the Writers' Guild left to join the Writers of Yavo. Up to that point, the group, who believed it was their duty to write the perfect age, had been relatively small. Like the Writers of Yavo, most of the popular factions or cults of the day focused on Yavo in one way or another. The old cults, such as the Tree and Sacred Stone, had vanished for the most part, leaving way to disagreements in the beliefs of Yavo for the most part. Asemleth passed away in 6284 DE at the age of 339, leaving the throne to his third and youngest son. Some footnotes for this notebook from the line of Caraf, written by Fahl in 6985. Worth mentioning, as the Writers of Yavo would eventually become one of the three largest sects in all of Dany. After the Judgment Age, most of the Dany believed one would either end up in the Perfect Age or Yakuv's Age. Obviously, most wanted to live in the Perfect Age, but there were, of course, a variety of beliefs on how that was accomplished. Now here we see some first mention to using servants for games, which I suppose relates also to the slaves being used for games and hunts, as we saw in Teledan. Well, the last king we're going to read about is King Caraf. King Caraf took the throne in 6731 DE at the age of 54. Caraf is probably the most well-known of all the kings, not because he was necessarily considered the best, but because he was the last. His name came to represent all of the kings in the later years, including the renaming of the Arch of the Kings to the Arch of Caraf. His mother had raised him to follow the teachings of Gish, and by the time he took the throne, he was believed to be a wholehearted believer in the followers. Because of that, and the experience of watching his father interact with his advisors, Caraf had decided from an early age that a king was no longer the correct way that Dany should be led. At least, he argued, not until the true great king would come. The fact that Caraf, in a single reign, was able to convince his people that the way they had ruled for thousands of years was wrong and should be changed, should be considered nothing short of miraculous. Caraf carefully crafted his arguments as a benefit for the guilds more than anything else. After all, he argued, Dany is the guilds, let us be protected by their fortress and be ruled by their wisdom. It was hard for the guilds not to support a proposal that removed the king from the highest authority and replaced him with 5 lords, lords that would be automatically chosen from the Grand Masters of the guilds. It gave all of the power of Dunny to the guilds, and there were only a few Grand Masters who seemed to disagree. Those few were known as faithful followers of the great king and Rhinaref, who had always supported the role of kings. Fortunately for Carafe, though his people believed a variety of different philosophical ideologies, only those who faithfully followed the original teachings of Rhinaref and the great king were disturbed at the thought of no king. And it was the majority of Dunny who no longer followed those beliefs, but instead those of Nemia, Gish, the Watcher, and various others. As a result, it was a cultural impact that the public had to overcome, and not a religious one. Carafe, attempting to further please the guilds, recommended new renovations and additions to the council chamber, and construction of a new guild hall, meant to celebrate the new power that would be theirs. A symbol of the new power of the guilds and lords, and further insult to the great king, burying his memory even further under government construction. Construction began in 6970 DE on the new guild hall. There was no better symbol of the attitude of the Dunny in 6970 DE. The tomb of the great king was further buried under massive buildings dedicated to government and the guilds. By the end of his reign, Carafe had convinced the majority of Dunny of his own beliefs. Most claimed to be followers of Gish and his writings, and most viewed the outsiders as a threat. If not now, then soon, Carafe often said. After his death, Carafe's words would be proven true with the onset of the Me-Dis War. Outside factions invaded with attempts to destroy the ink-making and bookmaking guilds, and almost succeeded. By the time the war would end, there would be few left who did not follow Gish and thus believe in the end of most outsider involvement. The discovery that conservative factions that led to the start of the Me-Dis War would come much later, when it was far too late to alter the conservative trends. Regardless, in 6977 DE, Carafe abdicated the throne and gave over the power of the kings to the first 5 lords of Dunny history. They were Lord Terry of the Guild of Messengers, Lord Hemela of the Guild of Healers, Lord Molef of the Guild of Caterers, Lord Kedry of the Guild of Writers, and Lord Corrinan of the Guild of Analysts. Carafe died 8 years later. The time of the kings was over. Footnotes taken from Carafe's public speech in which he first proposed the idea, from the first 5, written by Tarvis in 7000. Well, that's all the kings. I want to remind you again, I have no idea how to pronounce some of these things. It could just as easily be Kiraf instead of Carafe. I say Carafe anyway. Doesn't really matter all that much. And even in the context of the game, it was thousands of years ago. So no one's going to mind it if I mispronounce his name. Although all of the guilds, all of the kings are now done, we still have 4 notebooks left which are about Dunny society. So let's get started on those. The first is on the class system, written by someone called Trisha. Class structure. Seems as though my first inclination towards class structure was incorrect. Though early on there was little in the way of class society, such a high ideal faded quickly. By 9400 DE there were 7 very distinct classes. Elite, the lords and the grand masters of major guilds. It was possible for private citizens to be accepted, but if so, abundant resources were needed. It was only the elite who owned private libraries of books and the private islands. Quite a few obvious attempts to reach out and unify the classes, although I'm not sure if it did much good. Common libraries, major guild scholarships, renovation of poorer districts, all seemed more political than life-changing. Not surprising, I suppose. Guild members. Yes, it was possible for the lower classes to attend, but it seems by the end the schools were far too expensive and prestigious to allow for such. As a result, the graduates became a class among themselves, and a very high one at that. Upper class. The lowest of the 3 higher classes. Such citizens had succeeded in private enterprise and most likely provide the elite with their banks, pubs, etc. No major guild education for the most part, but enough money to buy their way into the upper classes. Middle class. Mostly shop owners and the like, able to afford some luxuries of Dunny but still considered far from the elite. Rare, but possible for them to own books as well as private ages. Seemed to make up most of the minor guild enrollment. High poor. The higher class of poor seemed to be made mostly of industrial workers, many of whom spent their time on foreign ages, before it was outlawed of course. It seemed that this class, along with the lower 2, did not own books. Low poor. I can't seem to find a better name for them, however it seems clear that there were 2 classes of poor. These low poor were relegated to their own districts and rarely seen even with the middle class and never with the upper classes, possibly used as servants, although that was generally looked down upon. Sub-low. reference to the least, an undefined subclass, are found on rare occasions. Not enough data to elucidate. Well, we know, of course, that the least are actually the Baro, which are different creatures and not a class of Dunny. Well, 3 more notebooks left, so I hope I will be able to finish in the next video.